All right, guys, so welcome back, and we're going to be doing now Chapter 19, okay? Chapter 19 is Planning, Zoning, and Environmental Hazards. Now, Chapter 19 is not going to be a huge chapter. There's only going to be one question in the exam. The only thing, though, is that there is a math question as well in this chapter that will go towards the 10 math questions that you will have. So technically, there should be about two questions coming out of here. It's not going to be a long chapter, but we do have to go through it, okay? So let's go ahead and get started with that. First things first, if you have your study guide, you can also do, for example, follow along, and I'm going to follow the terms as we go. First things first is the term called laissez-faire. Have you guys ever heard of a term in social studies back in the day called laissez-faire? So ultimately what laissez-faire means, it means that the person or the government in our case is very not lazy but hands off. Okay, that's what is referred to as laissez-faire. When a government is not as intrusive or has so much hands in the mix, it is known to be laissez-faire, which was the case for real estate, because in the old days, and I'm not talking about the 2000s or late 1900s, I'm talking about early on of when the country was established and things along those lines. You know, people had to own land, and the land was owned by people, especially after the United States took over. But since we didn't have so much growth and subdivision and the real estate industry as it is today, there was no need for government hands to be so involved like it is today. Now, you know, we have hundreds and thousands and millions of transactions happening every day. You know, we have subdividing where people don't have huge parcels of land, they have quarter acres. You know, so now the industry has changed where the government has had to step in and put a lot of regulation, a lot of things in place to make sure that we have some order within the chaos of what real estate could be. So that's why we gotta make sure that we know that the term laissez-faire means a hands-off approach when it comes to the government, its regulation in whatever industry they're talking about, or the government as a whole on society. Okay? Next, we have the Florida Growth Policy and Community Planning Act. This is the act that kind of gives the guidelines as to how these planning agencies and authorizations need to happen in order to be able to develop land and subdivide things and be able to do it in a way that's structured, organized, keeps everybody safe, and keep things moving the way they should. Okay? First, we have your local planning agency. Essentially, the local planning agency is the one that's responsible for subdivision plat approvals, site plan approvals, as well as sign control. Now, let's think about this logically, okay? If you're the planning agency and they're telling you that your responsibilities are subdivision plat approval. Now, do you guys remember from chapter 1, what is a subdivision plat map? So a subdivision plat map is essentially the blueprint of a subdivision or whatever development the person or whoever owns it wants to do. So think about a subdivision plat map as the blueprints of the subdivision. Meaning, imagine taking 100 acres, subdividing it all, and being able to put in roads, being able to put in, you know, the parcels for how big they need to be, organize all that stuff. And the planning agency is now going to sit and evaluate the entire subdivision and give their plus or negative, their yay or nay, if you will. Okay? Now, that's going to be their first responsibility, approving those subdivision plat maps that meet the regulation required. Okay? Then from there, we have their second responsibility is going to be site plan approval. Now, what do you think that is? Because think about it. If they're approving the whole subdivision, each subdivision's got to have a site of where you're going to put a property. So ultimately, they want to evaluate and approve the entire subdivision, but then also each individual site to make sure it meets the required amount of acreage or square footage or whatever regulations are going to be put in place for that particular neighborhood or subdivision. Okay? And then lastly is going to be sign control. Okay? Now think about that. Sign control. What could they potentially be talking about? Okay? Take a couple of seconds. Try to figure out what you would think that would be in your head, okay, before I tell you. So now, what are we talking about? We're talking about subdivisions and then approving each individual site. Now, where do you guys think sign control would come in that equation? So essentially, think about a subdivision. When you're driving in a neighborhood or a subdivision, you're going to have signs that are on the side of the road. But what are potential dangers when you're inside a subdivision now? Could be kids playing around, coming in, they don't really look at the street, they're chasing a ball or whatever, and boom, that could be an accident. So what the planning agency does also is evaluates the sign distances from one to the next. Because think about that, and again, let's get very logical. It is when you're driving, right, and let's say you're driving on the road, and every time that a sign comes off, what must you do to make sure you read it? Take your eyes off the road, and now you got to go right back to the road. But if there's too many signs back to back to back to back, you're going to end up having to read those signs and take your eyes off the road, and a major accident could happen because now you could kill a child by accident. And ultimately, now we're looking at huge problems. So the planning agency makes sure that there's enough distance from sign to sign. So although you end up you end up driving and you do have to take eyes off the road to read those signs, there's enough time for you to be able to, take your eyes back on the road before the next sign comes and you avoid accidents. So that is the other big thing for the planning agency. Again, the responsibilities are approving subdivision plat maps or the blueprint for the subdivision, each individual site, as well as the control of the signs of how close they are to one another. Okay? That's going to be your local planning agency's authorities and responsibilities. Okay? Now, we have to there's one particular math question in this chapter where we need to calculate lots per acre, meaning we need to figure out if we have a certain amount of land, based on the qualifications for that land, how many lots can we build in that property. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that one at the very end. Okay, so I'm not going to go ahead and do that one now. We'll tackle it at the end of the chapter. So let's keep moving. Next, we're going to look at zoning ordinances. This is very, very important because when you're looking at zoning ordinances, what is zoning? So essentially, zoning comes down to how you use the land, the usage of the land. Meaning that, because think about it like this. What would be the most profitable way to utilize a piece of land? Putting a commercial property, something that makes you money. Okay, but when you have commercial properties, now you have potential issues that may arise. So when you have areas deemed as residential per se, or they're zoned for residential, you cannot build a commercial property on those. So you need to understand the zoning, because depending on what the zoning is what you can actually build or not build or use or not use the property for. So it's very, very important to know, because if you want to buy a house, you may buy a residential property, which will be cheaper than buying a commercial property, because now you're talking business. And it also is going to play into effect when it comes to the monetary amount that it will cost to purchase certain lands, depending on the zoning or usage that you can give those particular parcels of land. So the zoning classifications are residential, the same thing as the areas on chapter 1 that we can practice in real estate. Residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural, and what we call special use. Okay, special use are going to be specific ones that have combined zonings within the same building. For example, if we're seeing it more and more in our town now, but ultimately you'll see it more in big cities. For example, college towns and big cities where you'll have a building where the first floor will be, let's say, a bakery or a commercially zoned part, and then from the second or third floor up are apartment buildings, and that's residential from the second or third floor on. So it's special use because it's combined. You have commercial in the bottom, and you can have shops, which I'm sure you see it when you go to like places like New York. You see it when you go to college towns. They have shops in the bottom, and then they have apartment buildings towards the top. Like for example, in Tampa, I have a cousin who lived in Channelside. Well, in the apartment building he lived in, the bottom floor was a bar, a restaurant or a bar that people would go, but the apartment started from like the second or third floor on going up, and it was like a 10-story building or something like that. So it was a special use because it was residential going above for the apartment buildings, but the bottom was commercial for the restaurant / bar that was there. So that will be classified as special use because it combines the zonings, when we usually stick to one zoning per parcel or area. Okay? Also, what you want to know is under commercial, there's a little area called a buffer zone. Okay? The term buffer zone means that it separates one zone usage to the next. So your buffer zone will split up, let's say, residential from commercial. As hard as that is going to get. Okay? Next, we have what we call building codes. Okay? Building codes, why are building codes put in place? Meaning, why is there specific rules to be able to build? So why are they so strict? And what are they? So think about that. Ultimately, it prevents from building properties and things in a very cheaper way that people cut corners. So essentially it prevents cutting corners, and it keeps the integrity of the buildings to what it should be. And it also prevents, less than correct building practices. Because think about it like that, in the sense that if there are not strict rules, people that are going to build, they're going to try to save as much money as possible. They're going to cut corners here and there, and they're not going to do what they're supposed to do or build it the right way. So now you could have potential, issues with insurance. You could have potential issues with the property deteriorating faster than it should, and in many cases even, falling. So that's the parts that we don't want it to happen. So building codes are put in place to prevent substandard building practices. Okay? Now, when it comes to building codes and things like that, we want to make sure that we understand that if you're building a new construction property, the golden ticket is going to be what is known as the CO, or the Certificate of Occupancy. Think about that. Certificate of Occupancy. What would that tell you? That tells you that the property has been inspected, is completed, and you've received a certificate that now you can occupy the property. Meaning, whenever you're buying new construction, once you have that, now you can close. Because the city has inspected it, the inspector has gone by and given the green light on everything on the property. Okay? So, that is going to be extremely important for you guys, because that is going to essentially allow you to close the deal and be able to now occupy your property. Okay? So next, we're going to look at health ordinances, and that basically means that the right things have been put in place to keep things sanitary when it comes to sewage, when it comes to drainage, when it comes to preparing the property to make sure that there's nothing that could bring mold or potentially bring issues to the property. Next, we have the most important part of this section aside from the math, where most likely your question will pop out of, okay? And this is going to be your appeals or exception to zoning laws, okay? Meaning, if you have a property that's residential, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use that property exactly how it says. sometimes you can petition to request an exception and be able to use the property differently than the current zoning usage. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get approved every single time, but it would allow you to be able to, in case there's an issue or a problem, to still utilize the property separately or in a different way. For example, we have 3 kinds of exceptions or 3 kinds of petitions we can require depending on the situation to use the land differently than what is currently zoned at. For example, first we have what is called a variance, okay? So a variance is given when there is an undue hardship to the owner to be able to complete a project or utilize the property as they thought it was going to be used. So for example, let's look at a property that you're building brand new. So imagine that you have the outline of the property, right? Now, there's such a thing called a setback, okay? Meaning that the state, depending on the zoning, will require a certain amount of distance from the property line to the beginning of the building. Meaning there's got to be enough space from all sides of your property line to where the building begins in order to be legally permissible to build. But let's say now that the back of the property has a river or some sort of water attached to it. And since you put a big building and you pushed it all the way to the back, you put it practically right at the end of the setback. So let's say that the setback is 15 feet from the back. So what that means is that from the property line to the beginning of the building, there's got to be 15 feet in between to be under code and under zoning. But now let's just say that you put it exactly at 15 feet or 16 feet because you wanted to push the property all the way back. But since everything you had enough space, no problem, no harm, no foul. You got green light, you pulled your permits, and you started the process, the build, whatever. But let's just say now that a strong storm came in, like a Debbie or something that hit recently, and now the river grew and it took away 5 feet or 3 feet or, however. Now, technically, there's not enough distance from the property line to the back of the building because the erosion of the river. Now, technically, you can't build. That would be technically illegal at that point. But you already received authorization that you could, or you have already started a process where it was permissible to build with that building where it is. So now you have to get an exception. Now you're going to have to go to the city and petition for a variance because essentially the distance now has to be altered because of a natural effect or an undue hardship to the owner that now prevents them from building as the law normally stated. So when the state evaluates it and says, hey, look, I see here that it did get taken out and originally you had enough space, we're going to give you that exception. Now you can continue to build even though it's less than the traditional setback rule. Now with the variance, now you can continue to build and finish out your, continue to build and finish it out and you have no problems because you got that exception. Even though that property violates the regular zoning laws, but they've given you that exception. So that's going to be your first one, variance. Meaning that the rule will vary from traditional rule because it would be an undue hardship to the owner of the property to have to restart from scratch when they've already done, let's say, half the project. Okay? So keep that in mind. That's going to be your first one. Okay. Number 2 is going to be a special exception. Again, think about the name. What happens when you get a special exemption for something or exception? It means that you can do something that other people can't because you have that special exception. Now, translating it to what we're talking about, that would be the equivalent of having, let's say, a commercial property in an area that's residentially zoned. Now, where do you normally see those kinds of scenarios? We're going to see those kinds of scenarios in big neighborhoods that have commercial properties within them. For example, if you're local to Ocala, that would be like a Marion Oaks, where now inside the neighborhood that is completely zoned residential, there's a supermarket, there are dentist offices, banks, restaurants, Domino's Pizza, laundromats, pretty much other commercial establishments that make the community or the neighborhood more desirable for people. And that's why a lot of the times they give the special exemptions or exceptions, because they understand that it's a huge community. So therefore, it's going to help the community and build it up in value if they allow these particular establishments that are zoned differently than the regular residential to be within the neighborhood. So all those places would have special exceptions to be able to open up an establishment in that normally residentially zoned neighborhood. So that would be the equivalent. Again, a variance is something that it's an undue hardship to the owner so they can use the property differently. A special exception is to bring a different zoning into a different zoning area. For example, commercial into residential, like I just explained in those neighborhoods. And then lastly, we have what is called a non-conforming use, special exception. Now, let's think about that one. Non-conforming use, okay? Meaning that it doesn't conform to the current zoning code. But you could say, okay, Ricky, but ultimately, you're bringing a business into a residential zone, that would technically be similar. It could, but think about, in this case, it's kind of backwards. It's, for example, imagine if, let's say, your family owned a little gas station back in the early 1900s somewhere. And that entire area now gets zoned for residential. Well, you already had the gas station where it was for many years. Now, under those conditions, what the state or the county will do is say, okay, since you were already here prior to the rezoning, we will allow you to stay here even though this property doesn't conform, listen to the name, doesn't conform to the new zoning classification. And that is where the term non-conforming use comes in, because now it's backwards. Now you were there first, and essentially they're grandfathering you in. And that's what we call grandfathered in, because you were there before. So then they give you your permit for non-conforming use, because since you were there, now that establishment doesn't conform to everything or the new zoning classification. Now, if let's say you keep it for the rest of your life and your family, it'll stay there because you have your exception. But if you sell it though, now they will not continue to give it that non-conforming use. The only reason they allowed it and grandfathered it in is because you were there prior to the rezoning or the rezoning classification. So keep that in mind. Variance, when there's an undue hardship. Then you have a special exception when you're trying to go into an area that is zoned differently. And non-conforming use is when you were already there and that property no longer conforms to the new zoning code. And again, guys, try to use this trick. I remind you guys throughout the course, but remember, when you're giving yourself your explanations and you're trying to figure out what it is that you're talking about, if you can use the name of the term or whatever you're trying to learn within the explanation, it creates a mental connection to the material and is easier for you guys to remember things. Listen closely. A non-conforming use example or exception comes in when the land was already there but doesn't conform anymore to the new zoning classification. So I use the term conforming in my explanation to remind me that the actual term is a non-conforming use exception. Okay, guys? So try to utilize those little techniques to be able to make that mental connection and make your life a little easier when it comes to studying. Because remember, the goal is not to memorize. The goal is to learn and create these tricks to be able to pass that exam. Because a lot of this stuff we won't need once we get the license. A lot of this stuff will, but the majority of it we won't, because it's all theory. So this kind of stuff will be needed, though, because sometimes you have investors that might need variances, that might need non-conforming uses. So make sure you understand at least this portion. Okay? Next, we have what we call a PUD, or planned unit development. Now, do you guys know or have heard of any of these? Now, if you're in Central Florida, you absolutely, or in Florida for the most part, you will 100% have heard of these before. Now, whether you knew these were PUDs, that's a whole different ballgame. But every single one of us that has lived in Florida, or in specifically Central Florida, has heard of PUDs. Again, you just never knew they were technically PUDs. Can you guess what type of properties these are, or what type of structures we have to or are used that qualify as PUDs that are commonly known? Now, 3, 2, 1 is going to be our 55 plus communities, the villages. So if you heard of the villages, which I'm sure you have, hopefully, that is a PUD. Now, the reason these structures are PUDs, or the way that these are built and created, is because the entire model of a PUD is to cluster homes and utilize the land for amenities and other things such as golf clubs, clubhouses, gyms, and all the amenities 55 plus communities provide for their members. Okay? So, the reason they're PUDs, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that all PUDs are 55 plus communities, because they're not. PUD is the structure. And because 55 plus communities fall within that structure, they're PUDs. And ultimately, think about it, again, very logical. If you're a retiree, somebody that just wants to, let's say, downsize and have many activities available for you to be able to stay entertained and you to be able to have fun now that your kids are grown, you're empty nesters. So a lot of those people will sell their big estates, their acreages and all that stuff, because they don't want to deal with that anymore. They want an HOA, or a homeowners association, that takes care of the lawn, the trash, and everything that they have to do in the house for the most part. So this is where these communities come in, because now they can downsize, have something smaller for themselves, and at the same time be able to save money on mortgages and things like that, depending on what they sold, or actually get a savings now. Because if you have, let's say, an $800,000 estate that's what you use and where you live to raise your kids, now you can sell that, get a $300,000, $400,000 property, and now you have money to save, money to invest, whatever the case may be. But the important part is that PUDs are that model. Clustered homes where you have more land to be able to build and for amenities, use for amenities. Okay, guys? Next, we also have what is called, we have to look at the environmental hazards associated with real estate. Now, these don't necessarily mean that you have to know them in a lot of detail. You just want to know certain hazards that we have to deal with, and in many cases give disclosures and give information to customers. Those are going to be asbestos. So now, because real estate properties always deal with insulation and things like that, asbestos can be an issue. So disclosures are going to have to be given. Radon gas. Florida is a state that has natural protruding radon gas coming from the land. That's nothing that we can control. Now, the good thing is that radon gas is not really toxic in open areas. It's only toxic in enclosed small areas with no ventilation. But technically is a tasteless, odorless gas that, again, in closed areas can be toxic. So we have to keep that in mind. But usually if it's open areas, it's not going to affect us. Next, we have your lead-based paint disclosure. Okay, so any home from 1978 or older has to have this disclosure by law. So anytime that I prepare documents or prepare contracts for an offer or things like that, the minute I look at the property, the year that it's built, and it says 1978 or older, let's say it says 1970, I automatically know I have to include a lead-based disclosure within the documents in the offer. Okay? Next, we have mold. Mold is just, exactly what it is. Just, it's a fungus that it can also be toxic especially if it's black mold. So if you ever see mold in properties and things like that, you want to try to make sure you address that quickly, because mold can compound and can increase, and it can be very toxic, guys. And then lastly, wood destroying organisms, or what we call WDOs. Those are going to be things like termite or anything that can destroy wood. So that's another hazard that we have to kind of keep in mind, because we have a lot of wood in the homes. The homes could be, block, but the framing within the house is usually wood. So definitely want to make sure you get those tested, and when you're getting your inspections done, they'll check for WDO or any kind of termites and things like that. Okay, guys, so that's going to pretty much do for chapter 19. Now, the only thing left that we have to do is going to be our math problem, okay, which is going to be calculating lots per acre. So let's go ahead and tackle that now, so we can go ahead and complete our chapter 19. Okay? So I'm going to bring the board here. And now we're going to be looking at lots per acre. Let me get to the right page. Here we go. Now, in your book, if you have it, then they're going to give you some sort of formula and all that stuff. Don't worry about the formula, because this is a very logical equation that, as long as we understand what we're doing and how it actually supposed to work, you will never need an equation to memorize it to be able to solve this out, because your common sense and logic is going to carry you through. Okay? So let's look at an example. So a tract of 100 acres. So you have actually, I'll read the question out first, and then I'll explain that portion next. So a tract of 100 acres is being developed. The applicable zoning requires a minimum of 9,000 square feet per residential lot. The developer must set aside 25% of the acreage for streets, sidewalks, and so forth. Then, how many buildable lots can we have in the tract or the area? Okay? So now, again, I always like to make a point to write my variables on the left before I begin calculating, so we can, I don't get caught up so much on the jargon of the problem and can focus mainly on the information. So this is going to be our buildable lots. That's going to be chapter 19 for you guys. Okay? So now I'm going to go ahead and write my variables right over here. So that's going to be, I have 100-acre tract. So that's my variables. Okay? So I have my 100-acre tract. The problem also told me that each lot minimally must be 9,000 square feet. Okay? So 9,000 square feet per lot, minimally. So no less than 9,000. Anything under 9,000 will not qualify as a lot. Okay? You can go above, depending on how you structure your particular subdivision. You can make them a little bit bigger if you want to present bigger lots. That's strictly on the developer at that point. But each particular, and this is where now, when we talked about earlier, site plan approvals. If each lot is not 9,000 square feet, the planning agency is going to say, wait a minute, this cannot fly. You're at 8,500 square feet. It's got to be minimally 9,000. And now you're going to have to go back and redo the entire blueprint because you're not meeting zoning guidelines. Okay? And again, that's where the zoning planning agency comes in. And they approve these particular sites. Okay? Next, we have they're telling us that we must set aside 25% for streets, sidewalks, etc., etc., etc. And now they're telling us how many lots can I actually build on this property. Okay? Cool. Let's go ahead now. Forget that we have equations, and let's use our logic and common sense to work this problem out. Okay? So first things first, I have, what do we have here? 100-acre tract, 9,000 square feet per lot, and we must set aside 25%. So logically, my first step is understanding that I have 100 acres. Imagine that is your plot of land, 100 acres. Okay? Now, what does the problem tell us? That we must set aside 25% for streets and everything. Now, I don't necessarily have to draw out the blueprint. All I have to do is remove a quarter of the land, because now 25% of it I can't build. I can't use it for my lots because I need streets, I need sidewalks, I need other things that are going to be required for the subdivision. So ultimately, that will be my logical step. I got 100 acres, remove a quarter of it. Okay? So if I have 100 acres, and how much am I going to be able to build on? 75%, correct? So if, let's say, you want to go ahead and multiply by 0.75, because that's how much you can build. Okay, guys? So that is going to give you, essentially, because they do it completely different in the book, just so you know. So pull out your calculators, and let's work this out together. So now we have 100 acres times 0.75. I mean, it's an easy mental math, I understand, but always, always, always make a point to punch it in the calculator. That is one trick that I'm going to pass on to you guys now, because sometimes when we're stressed, when we're rushing because we're running out of time, whenever there's a question is massive, and we do mental math, we tend to miss a zero here and there. We tend to put a decimal place in the wrong spot. Make a point to punch it in. Take the extra 30 seconds, 15 seconds to punch it in and verify that your mind didn't miss a zero or misplace the decimal point, because again, on the exam, they're going to give you the most common mistakes as answer choices. So if they determine over experimentation and research that everybody forgot to put a zero, one of the answers will be that number minus a zero. And now you're going to think you got it right, circle the wrong answer, and you're going to lose a point. And now if you do that several times, you're going to miss a few points, and a lot of the times people don't pass the exam by a point, 2, 3 points. So you want to make sure you pick up those little extra points. And a lot of times it could be as easy as punching it in your calculator, verifying that you didn't miss a zero or a decimal point. Okay? So now 100 times 0.75 obviously is going to give us 75 acres. That's the first way of doing it. Now, a lot of the times what you could do is, if let's say you can't grasp the idea of, okay, 25 to set aside, so I got to multiply by 75, there's the other two-step process that you could also do if it's easier for you. You take now the 100 acres, multiply it by your 0.25, that is going to give you 25 acres. Then you got to do step 2, which is do 100 acres minus the 25, and that's going to give you your 75 acres. Either or. You can do it in one step, or you can do it in 2 steps, where you have part A and part B. Whatever makes the most sense for you guys, by all means. I prefer to go the easier route in the sense of one step, So what I have to think about is, okay, they're telling me I got 100 acres, but I cannot use 25% of it. So how much can I actually build on? 75, so I'm going to use 75. As opposed to doing the two-step process of saying, oh, okay, it's 25% I cannot use, so I get 25 acres, and then subtract it from my 100 so I can get now the amount that I can build on. Whichever way you do, doesn't really make a difference. It's strictly what makes sense in your head. And again, we want to keep this thing logical. Okay? So that means that we have 75 acres that we can actually build on. Okay? We already took away our 25 from our 100. Now that we know that it's 75 buildable acres, now we need to understand how to do the second portion, because they're telling us that 9,000 square feet are required per lot. Okay, but we have 75 acres. So what are we going to need to make sure that we can make this conversion? We're going to need how much is how many square feet are in 1 acre. Okay, now 1 acre equals 43,560 square feet. Now, if you remember from other chapters in the course and things like that, how did I tell you to memorize this number? The easiest way I've found over the years of research and things I've heard throughout the internet and the book, because it's even in your book, it's 4 people driving 35 on a 60. So again, 4 people driving 35 on a 60. So what I imagine, this is my mental vision to hopefully make it easier for you guys. Whenever I'm thinking how many square feet are in an acre, and I know it's for whatever. So I'm thinking, I imagine a little car, like a little Prius or whatever, in the middle of a storm, on the right lane with 4 people super scared, driving in the pouring rain, looking at their speedometer saying 35 miles an hour, and then all of a sudden looking up and seeing a 60 mile an hour sign go by them. So what does that tell me? That tells me that there's 4 people in the car, the speedometer is the next number, 35, and the 60 mile an hour is the finishing. Because the issue, most of the mistakes come from swapping the 5 and the 6. That is where the majority of the mistakes come from, because most people will remember the 43,000, but they'll combine or they'll mix up the 6 and the 5. Now, that's why to me, that's the easiest way, because the 4 is always there, the 35 and then the 60 will split up the 5 and the 6, so I'll never get them mixed up. Because I know it's not 36 miles an hour, it's 35 miles an hour going 60. Okay? So just keep that in mind. And again, the vision is 4 old people driving 35 on a 60. So visualize that in your head. Take a second, pause the video right now, close your eyes, and visualize exactly what I just explained. Because once you get that mental picture in your head, you will never, ever, ever get this number wrong. And that is the goal, so you don't never forget or have to memorize it. Because again, when you're stressed in the exam, memorization could cause these 2 numbers to flip, and now you're going to get the question wrong. Okay, so now that we have our square feet per acre, now we need to find out how many square feet we have, because we have 75 acres. So now what must I do? I got to take my 75 and multiply it by my 43,560. Okay? So now we take our calculators and we put 75 times 43,560. That is going to give us 3,267,000 square feet. Now you can say to yourself, holy crap, Coach Rich, that is a huge number. Okay, it is a huge number, and it could also lead you to believe that maybe you're doing it wrong, which used to happen to me, because I used to say, man, 3 million blah, 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 blah square feet. But then that is where you want to use your logic and be able to relate what you're talking about to make sure at least you give yourself, your mind, that intuition, or not intuition, but that cue that you're moving in the right direction. For example, just thinking about the fact that 1 acre is 43,000 and change square feet, and you have 75, it has to be a massive number. Because if 1 is 43,000, how many you think 75 will be? And the minute you think in that way, it instantly makes that number logically huge. So at least it allows you to feel like, okay, I'm moving in the right direction and I didn't calculate something wrong. Because that's really all we're doing at that point, just checking ourselves to make sure that that massive number makes sense. If it makes sense because of that logic, then just keep moving forward because you know you're walking in the right direction. Okay? So now that we know that 75 acres is 3,267,000 square feet, the problem is telling us that one lot in itself has to be 9,000. The smallest amount. Okay, so now what do? I take my 3,967,000 and divide it by 9,000, which will be one lot. After I take my 3,267,000 divided by 9,000, that is going to give me exactly 363 lots. And that is going to be your answer. Okay? So all of this boils down that in a 100-acre tract where each lot minimally has to be 9,000 square feet and we must set aside 25%, we can build 363 lots now. That's going to be your answer, guys. As simple as that. Now, there is an equation in your book that pretty much breaks this down and you get to the same answer. It's a little bit different than my way, but I don't want you guys to have to remember or memorize equations. This is very logical and it takes you step by step. So, before I go ahead and finish, let's do one more example to make sure we finalize it and we solidify it in our minds, and then we'll go ahead and continue to a different chapter. So let me go ahead and erase this and we'll do one more example to make sure that we can definitely get a grasp on this topic, because this will 100% be in your exam. And is a very simple question that you guys should be able to get right. And again, sometimes that extra point or 2 points will be the difference between passing and having to retake this entire exam. All right? So let's look at example 2. A tract of 20 acres is being developed. The county requires that the subdivision reserve 10% of the tract for common spaces. The developer is also planning an entry road that will be 500 feet by 30 feet wide. The county requires a minimum of 12,000 square feet per residential lot. So how many buildable lots are in that tract? Okay, now they just threw us an extra variable. But it won't make a difference because, again, we are understanding what we're doing. We're not memorizing anything. Once we can understand, your brain can now use logic and common sense to make the problem easy and workable for us. So again, let's go ahead and write our variables. They tell us that we have 20 acres. We have a 20-acre tract. They're also telling us that we have to reserve 10%. So reserve or set aside 10% for roads and streets and everything else. Also, they're telling us that there's an entry road that is going to measure 500 feet by 30 feet wide. So 500 feet by 30 feet. Okay? And then lastly, they're telling us that the minimum square foot per lot in this particular scenario is going to be 12,000 square feet. Okay, so minimally, the other one was 9,000. This subdivision, they're telling us that the lots have to be bigger to meet zoning code or whatever, the subdivision, the planning agency will allow. Okay? So let's look at this. First things first, we go right back to logic. Okay? How many acres do we have in our tract? We have 20 acres. And again, guys, it don't necessarily mean that has to be squared. I just use it for a visual cue, and it just allows my brain to have more logic in what I'm doing if I can visually see it and take myself through those steps. Because again, I'm not memorizing anything. I have to go through my process to be able to logically start figuring out the problem. And that's what you want to do. Build your 20 acres. Remember, they said take 10% away. So that's going to be 10%. So therefore, and again, looking at the other problem, you can do your 2 steps, figure out what 10% of 20 acres and subtract it from it if you like. But the way I like to do it is I ask myself, and it keeps me practicing with the logic. If I have to put away or set aside 10%, how much can I build on now? Well, I can build on 90%. If they're telling me I have to take away 10%. So now I take my 20 acres and multiply it by my 0.9 or 90%. Okay? So once I do that, so I take my 20 acres times 0.9, that gives me 18 acres. Again, that's step 1. Step 2, I take my 20, multiply by my 10%. If I multiply by my 10%, that is going to give me 2. And then I take 20 minus 2 will be 18 acres. Same thing. First way, second way, part A, and then part B, just like we did last time. The only difference is we did it in 1 step here, we did it in 2 steps there. Same answer. The goal is the same. Whatever makes sense for you. Okay? So 18 acres is what we actually can build on. All right? Now, we do have one extra variable though. We have the entry road that we have to account for that can't be built on either. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 500 times my 30 so I can figure out my squared feet. Because each of them, they're telling us, so essentially 500 by 30. Oh no, actually it's the other way around. But either way. So if you want to visualize that, the first number is always the front footage and the second is the back. So usually the roadway would be something along this line. 500 by 30 feet. It's just a long road. But at the end of the day, we don't necessarily have to visualize it because we just need the square footage. So 500 times 30 will give me 500 times 30, 15,000 square feet. Okay? So I already know 15,000 square feet can be built on. But I still have that 18 acres that I can build on. But remember, let's not forget, we have to remove that. So in order for me to take that amount from acreage, I have to already find out how many square feet 18 acreage means so they can be in the same metric. And then I could actually do some math. How much do we say in the previous example is how many square feet are in 1 acre? Remember, close your eyes, visualize the little car on the right hand side, and 4 people scared, seeing the speedometer going 35 in the middle of a storm, and then a 60 mile an hour going right by you. Okay? So that's going to put us as 1 acre equals 43,560. Okay? Remember, 4 people driving 35 on a 60. Now, the reason we say old people is because they're the ones that tend to be a little bit more scared of the road, especially on a storm. We want to stick to the logic. It could be 4 young people, could be whatever. Ultimately, it's just a matter of something that helps you remember. Okay, so now if I have 18 acres and multiply by my 43,560, that will give me 18 acres times 43,560, 784,080 square feet. And again, if you think it's a big number, say to yourself, okay, I have 18, 1 is 43,000, and I got 18, so it's got to be a big number. Okay, so 784. Now, how much do we say we had was our driveway? 15,000 square feet. But now we have square feet right here. So the only thing we have to do, that's the logical step, is to remove the 15,000 from the total square feet that I can build on. So now that I know that I have to remove the 15,000, that leaves me with 769,080 square feet. So far what I've done is taken my 20 acres, remove my 10%, figure out how many acres I can build on, then converted it to square feet, and then plugged in that I have a driveway of 15,000 square feet that obviously is not going to be a lot, so it's got to be removed. That leaves me with my total square feet that I can build on, and now the problem tells us that each lot has to be 12,000 square feet. So now I take my 769.80 divided by 12,000, which is each lot, and that will give me, divided by 12,000, 64.09. Now guys, be very careful with an answer like these, because if it's an answer like this, the problems will give you something along the lines of A will be 64, B will be 65, C will be 66. Now, if let's say you got a 0.5 or a 0.6 or above, what have we been taught in schools to usually do? Round. But the problem is, when we're dealing with lots, if there's any decimal whatsoever, it's not 12,000 square feet. So therefore, you cannot create an extra lot of partial land. It's gotta have minimally your 12,000 square feet, otherwise it cannot be a lot. So any decimal, whether it be this or whether it be 0.999, is not 12,000 square feet, so you cannot count it as a lot. So in this particular scenario, any decimal will drop off, and your answer is going to be your whole number. So the answer for this question is going to be 64 lots. Again, because any decimal places means that you have extra land, but it's not 12,000 square feet. Otherwise, it would be already a whole number. So any decimals, again, you're going to drop off and keep the whole number, because that is the total buildable lot. Now the little extra you can use for something else like streets, whatever you want as a developer. All right, guys? So that is going to be your second example on buildable lots. And again, very, very logical. Just go through the information, take your time, work it out slowly so you can start putting in the logic into each step. And as long as you can figure out how all this works and use your logical mind, you will not have to memorize no equation, or regardless of how they feed you the problem in the exam. As long as you have that in your head and you know how it all works and you understand it, you will always be able to figure it out. Whether they throw it to you left way, right way, upside down, don't make a difference. You're going to know because you know what you're doing. You know how the problem works through strictly common sense and logic. Right, guys? So that's going to conclude on chapter 19. Again, there's one question from the state exam, one question that's going to come to math equations, and ultimately, hopefully you'll be able to get those extra points correct. All right, guys? So that is going to conclude chapter 19, and I'll see you on the next chapter.